Today, the Subcommittee on Homeland Security is having a hearing entitled Combating Transnational Criminal Organizations and Related Trafficking. I'm officially calling this meeting to order. Make some quick opening remarks, and then we'll turn it over to our witnesses. Listen, I don't need to tell people here fentanyl is a nightmare like nothing that this country has ever seen before. I think every member of this subcommittee has family members or met with family members inside their communities that have lost a loved one to fentanyl. And the fact of the matter is, this is a product that is being trafficked into the United States by criminal organizations that have their roots in Mexico and other places south of our southern border. We've faced a lot of drug epidemics over the years, but this one is different, and it requires a different, more focused approach from this Congress. Today, we're going to have the opportunity for a detailed discussion with officials from the Department of Homeland Security who play a critical role in interrupting the flow of fentanyl into the United States. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the cartels and the gangs that deal in death and the trafficking of humans, firearms, and drugs. These cartels bring in chemicals, mostly from China, produce fentanyl or products laced with fentanyl. This largely happens in Mexico, and then transports those pills into the United States and sells them here. I think this subcommittee and the Appropriations Committee at large has the opportunity this year to make a major investment in the capacities that you are going to talk about here today. And let me just pose a few suggestions. I released a set of suggestions yesterday that I hope we'll talk about today. First, there is no reason that we can't detect and seize more fentanyl at the ports of entry and international mail facilities. The more funding we provide, the more drugs that get taken off the market, the higher the price gets, the harder it becomes for the cartels and the sellers to do their business. Today, we're inspecting 40% of the vehicles that enter the United States. There's just no reason why we can't jump that number to 60, 65, 70% in the next fiscal year. Second, we've got these HSI task forces like FAST in San Diego. We'll talk about them today. They're bringing together effectively state, local, federal partners to go after these cartels, to go after this trade. We should fund more of them. Third, we've got to understand this is a two-way street. Drugs come into this country, but cash and guns, they cross into Mexico. The United States rightly complains to Mexico that they're not doing enough to stop the drugs from coming into the United States. But Mexico rightly complains to us that we're not doing enough to stop the guns and the cash, the profits that move back into Mexico. And so we have the ability to increase the amount of outbound inspections that we are doing to make sure that we're catching more of those illicit profits and firearms before they make their way into the hands of the cartels. And then lastly, we could allocate more resources to help Mexico stop the precursor chemicals from getting to Mexico in the first place. A bipartisan group of us went to meet with President López Obrador last month. He committed to us to partner with us in that work. The last two things to say are these, and I'll turn it over to Senator Britt for opening comments. All of this investment in stopping fentanyl from getting to the United States would be impossible under last week's House Republican vote. Under their plan, FY24 funding for the Department of Homeland Security would be cut by 22%. We're not talking about a single expansion of our fight against fentanyl. The budget proposal from the House would drastically cut funding at the border, would drastically cut funding for the very capacities that right now are trying to fight fentanyl from coming into the United States. And the final thing to say is this. If you watch some folks on cable news, you'd come to the conclusion that every immigrant to the United States, every asylum seeker is potentially a risk. And while there is certainly an amount of fentanyl that's coming into the United States in between our ports of entry, 90 to 95% of it is coming in through the ports of entry. And so we need to have a conversation about how we comprehensively reform our immigration system, and I think that involves a tough conversation about asylum reform and about putting more resources at the border. That's absolutely an element of this conversation. But the fact of the matter is, it is by and large not the individuals who are sneaking in between the ports of entry or presenting themselves for asylum in between or at the ports of entry that are bringing in the fentanyl. It is actually vehicles and individuals that are crossing at the ports of entry. We can do a much better job of stopping that traffic. Again, grateful to have a pretty full committee attendance today. I think that's a signal of how interested we are as a body on both sides of the aisle in having this conversation with you. And with that, let me turn it over to Senator Britt for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your willingness to be a part of this conversation. The cartels and transnational criminal organizations that bring fentanyl into America and engage in human trafficking, including that of children, must be stopped. The Department of Homeland Security, with its broad authorities and dedicated workforce, plays an important part in these efforts. In particular, Customs and Border Protection's Office of Field Operations and Immigration and Custom Enforcement's Homeland Security investigations. I would like to first address the issue of fentanyl. As well as every member of this subcommittee, we all know that the fentanyl is devastating our communities across this great nation. It is now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 45. More than 150 people die each day from an overdose related to fentanyl. At the current rate, more Americans will die in the next decade from fentanyl than combat deaths in all the wars since America's founding. Yet most of the fentanyl killing Americans is coming from abroad, starting as precursor chemicals in China before being turned into the deadly drug by the Mexican cartels and then obtained from internet sources, shipped via mail, or smuggled across the border into the United States. Today's witnesses are subject matter experts on the interdiction of drugs and combating criminal organizations. Like the thousands of their colleagues, the officers, agents, and analysts who show up every day to work on the front lines, I want to say thank you. This ultimately is an appropriations hearing, so as ranking member of this subcommittee, I would be remiss if I did not note that President Biden's budget proposal for fiscal year 2024 for DHS lacks a coherent strategy and requests woefully underfunds and insufficiently resources, both with manpower and others, to DHS to be able to effectively fight this fight, and particularly looking at the amount of dangerous drugs that are entering this country on a daily basis. In FY 2022, CBP's Office of Field Operations interdicted 12,500 pounds of fentanyl at the ports of entry. Just halfway through FY 23, that level of interdiction has already been surpassed. But President Biden's budget proposal only requests to add 150 new officers to the already overworked and thinly stressed 25,000 officers who staff the ports of entry each day. And while the president's budget requests funding for additional inspection equipment at the borders, given how quickly the transnational criminal organizations adapt, the deployment of this technology and other types of technology being used, it has to be strategic, it has to be thoughtful, it has to be coherent. While the bulk of fentanyl is largely being brought through the ports of entry, the amount being seized between the ports of entry is also alarming. In all of FY 22, 2,200 pounds were seized by Border Patrol agents in between the ports of entry. That is enough to kill every single person in America. They have already seized 1,400 pounds through March of FY 23, including 264 pounds in January, 381 pounds in February, 531 pounds in March. This is 85% of the total amount seized in just the last 3 months. Similar to the great work done by CBP, we have seen time and time again that HSI's work is critical to our nation's efforts to interdict drugs, including the 21,000 pounds of fentanyl it seized in FY 22. But we have already surpassed that amount by nearly 10% halfway through fiscal year 2023. This begs the question, what happens in 8 days when Title 42 goes away and the 5,800 daily encounters that are averaged by Border Patrol agents by this own administration's admission will likely double? The answer is we are likely to see more fentanyl being brought in, which will lead to more American deaths, but also more deaths of migrants trying to buy their way into the United States by smuggling for the drug cartels. The reality is that President Biden knew this when he formulated his budget proposal for FY24. His administration notified Congress on January 26 that the public health emergency and Title 42 usage would end on May 11th. Yet on March 9th, the president released a budget request that proposed cutting the Department of Homeland Security's base budget by 1%. That budget proposal inadequately funds efforts to combat fentanyl, secure the border, and strongly enforce our nation's existing immigration laws. This is deeply irresponsible, and it is a direct disservice to the incredible men and women on the ground working to protect and serve our nation each and every day. This hearing, though, is not just about fentanyl. It is also about the transnational criminal organizations which traffic not just drugs, but in people, vulnerable men, women, and children who often pay with their lives, like the 53 migrants who died after being stuffed in a tractor trailer just last year. Smuggling people across the border nets the cartels $13 billion a year. HSI works to bring down the transnational criminal organizations, and these cartels need to be brought to justice. Yet FY24 President's budget for HSI calls for just 22 new positions, an increase of less than 0.5%, to combat human trafficking, child exploitation, counter fentanyl, and investigate cyber crimes. Similar to the worsening conditions we are likely to confront with fentanyl once Title 42 goes away, I am sure the cartels are already busy planning on how to take advantage of what is sure to be an even more chaotic situation and continuing to profit from human trafficking. The cartels are ruthless. They operate with near impunity in Mexico. They are well-financed, well-organized, and well-connected. While there are certainly differences among this committee on how to handle the crisis at the border, there is surely an agreement that something must be done to stop them from enslaving one more man, assaulting one more woman, or sexually trafficking one more child, or killing one more person. CBP and ICE do great work, but there is no doubt that more work needs to be done to stop the illegal flow of drugs and people across our borders, to take down the criminal organizations that profit from these activities. As ranking member of this subcommittee, I want to ensure CBP and ICE that you be properly funded. Effectively deploying your assets at our border is critical, where there is a crisis, even if this administration refuses to admit that. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses. I certainly look forward to a robust discussion today.
Thank you very much, Senator Britt. Let me introduce our witnesses and then ask you to provide testimony in the order of introduction. First is James Mandrick, who's the Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Intelligence and Analysis at CBP. Then Diane Sabatino, the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Field Operations at CBP. And finally, Mark Milholland, who's the Assistant Director for Countering Transnational Organized Crime at the Homeland Security Investigations Team. Welcome to all three of you. We'll ask that you give your testimony in 5 minutes or less. Your full statements will be submitted for the record.
Chairman Murphy, Vice Chair Collins, Ranking Member Britt, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today about the dangers of transnational criminal organizations and types of activities they're involved in that impact the CBP mission each day. The illicit activity of these groups, including the smuggling of narcotics, weapons, humans, and an array of financial crimes, pose a significant and ever-growing threat to our nation and has a direct impact on the safety and security of our citizens. While these groups operate across the world, the TCOs that are based out of Mexico, some of whom I'll briefly discuss today, pose the most direct and dangerous threat to the CBP mission. Mexico-based TCOs control the flow of drugs into the U.S., oversee well-established logistical supply chains, and maintain partnerships with criminal organizations in the U.S. that allow for product dissemination. In fiscal year 2022, CBP seized more than 500,000 pounds of hard narcotics and more than $76 million in illicit currency, the majority of which tied to TCO activity. There are a number of TCOs operating throughout Mexico behind those seizures, the groups that are able to exploit the lucrative smuggling corridors throughout the country. While it's nearly impossible to break out the exact proceeds from criminal activity, the scale of illicit activities conducted by these groups easily yields tens of billions of dollars each year. The most profitable activity for these TCOs is narcotic sales. However, they've become more diversified over the past decade into other illegal operations such as human smuggling and intertwine themselves in legitimate businesses to provide additional revenue streams. TCOs have found novel ways to profit from nearly all aspects of daily life, including sectors that are often overlooked, including agriculture, fuel theft, timber harvesting, and the fishing industry. It's important to note that TCOs are not one-way operators and are heavily reliant on their ability to move goods from the U.S. into Mexico, specifically firearms, ammunition, and proceeds from illicit activity. The two largest TCOs in Mexico that have been dominant in these spaces for the past few years are the Sinaloa cartel and the New Generation Jalisco cartel, or CJNG. The Sinaloa cartel is one of the largest and oldest and most established TCOs in Mexico. They're believed to have operational strongholds in nearly 2/3 of all Mexican states, with a heavy presence along the U.S. border and Baja California, Sonora, and Chihuahua states, growth that's primarily been realized through partnerships with other criminal groups. The Sinaloa cartel operates in a federated horizontal hierarchy with 4 main factions that afford the group full control over supply chains from beginning to end stages. CJNG has a different operational structure with more of a vertical hierarchy, directed by a former Mexican police officer with firm control over the group's activities. Through violence of action, including targeting security services, CJNG has rapidly expanded since its emergence in 2010 to have strongholds in over 2/3 of all Mexican states, as well as key border crossing areas just south of Texas. Both of these groups profit significantly from the sales of agriculture-based drugs like marijuana, heroin, and cocaine, and both have been able to adapt into new markets such as synthetic narcotics like methamphetamine and fentanyl. And both groups have proven quite successful at exploiting both illicit and licit sectors to increase their profit margins and offset potential losses from changes in customer demand. Despite the removal of some leadership, these groups have proven capable of maintaining control over large territories in Mexico, even expanding into smuggling corridors throughout the country, along the U.S. border, and at critical seaports inside Mexico, allowing access to narcotics and dangerous chemical precursors. Evolution has been a key to success for the TCOs in Mexico. As I mentioned previously, Mexican-based TCOs have drastically increased their involvement in human smuggling from the initial stages of mere peso collection for a few $100s per migrant to getting more involved in full-scale migrant facilitation in a sector that's worth billions of dollars each year. These TCOs have all shown their ability to rapidly evolve alongside technology, from the use of secure communication platforms to the use of drones for surveillance, drug smuggling, and attack purposes in Mexico, to the use of cryptocurrency for money movements, diversifying them away from trade-based money laundering and bulk cash currency. Most notably, though, has been the group's ability to rapidly respond to changes in the drug environment, such as legalization of marijuana and a decreased demand for heroin in the U.S. marketplace. TCOs in Mexico have been able to quickly pivot from agriculture-based drugs to synthetic narcotics to maximize profit margins. The focus on synthetics has allowed these groups to produce narcotics without needing to control large swaths of territory in Mexico. They're no longer subject to weather conditions or crop seasons, so they're allowed to produce year-round at industrial level production. Further highlighting the resiliency of these groups is how quickly they adapted to enforcement changes that removed access to finished fentanyl in 2019. Almost immediately, TCOs began acquiring chemical precursors and synthesizing fentanyl themselves, effectively allowing them to own the supply chain without interruption. The evolution of these groups has required CBP to become a more proactive technology, data, and intelligence-driven organization, utilizing intelligence professionals to secure our border, drive operational outcomes. Through a comprehensive collection mechanism to ensure access to much-needed intelligence reporting, analysis to identify tactics, techniques, and procedures of illicit actors, counter-network analysis, and exploitation of geospatial intelligence to maximize operational outcomes and officer safety, CBP is becoming more forward-leaning each day. I thank you for your time here today, your investment in intelligence professionals in CBP, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Chairman Murphy, Vice Chair Collins, and Ranking Member Britt, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss U.S. Customs and Border Protection's efforts to combat the dynamic threat of transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, and prevent the entry of dangerous illicit drugs, including fentanyl, through our nation's ports of entry. I'm really proud to represent the 30,000 dedicated frontline personnel of CBP's Office of Field Operations, commonly referred to as OFO, who work tirelessly every day to protect our border, our homeland, and our communities. I appreciate this subcommittee's unwavering support of our mission and for ensuring that we have the personnel, the technology, and other resources needed to conduct our complex and challenging border security responsibilities. CBP seizures of fentanyl at our ports of entry topped 13,000 pounds just halfway through this fiscal year. Just last month, our fentanyl seizures for the entire previous fiscal year, 2022, were exceeded. However, our efforts and actions to counter illicit drugs and TCO activities do not begin or end at the ports of entry. Our approach is multi-layered and targeted, and our efforts are driven by intelligence and analysis. Intelligence specialists at CBP's National Targeting Center and our local port analytical teams use advanced information, intelligence, and predictive analytics to identify potential high-risk shipments, cargo, and travelers before they reach our borders. While we are building our interdiction capabilities, we continue to focus also on modernizing and automating our processes to facilitate legitimate travel and trade, as that will allow our resources to focus on the threats as they evolve. Relieving our frontline personnel of administrative work, such as manual data entry or paper-based transactions, gives them the opportunity to do what they do best, which is to talk to people and to determine intent and increase situational awareness. The technology that CBP officers use at ports of entry is imperative to our operations. With the support of Congress, we continue to deploy advanced non-intrusive inspection systems, or NII, that can reliably and quickly detect suspect anomalies hidden in commercial and private conveyances, a critical tool for efficiently alerting officers when further scrutiny is needed. K-9 teams also provide invaluable detection capabilities. CBP was the first law enforcement agency to develop a discipline to detect fentanyl with K-9 units. And today, all Office of Field Operations concealed human and narcotic detection K-9 teams are trained to detect the odor of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. And we are currently scoping missions to support other countries with developing this capability. But beyond detection and interdiction, CBP officers also use field testing devices and work with both on-site and remote scientists to rapidly screen and identify suspected controlled substances. All information from drug seizures and laboratory analysis is fed back into our intelligence network and shared with our investigative partners. When it comes to dismantling TCOs, we must not only interdict what is coming into the country, but also what is going out. Thanks to this committee's support and additional funding in the FY23 appropriations, we've expanded and enhanced our outbound operations to stop the southbound flow of weapons and cash that fuel these criminal networks. In fiscal year 22, our outbound operations at the southwest border resulted in the seizure of more than $7 million in undeclared currency and 415 weapons, and we surpassed last year's weapons seizure in just the first 6 months of this fiscal year. Joint efforts to leverage our capabilities alongside those of our partners amplifies our accomplishments. For example, through Operation Blue Lotus, CBP and our Homeland Security investigation partners are surging intelligence, analysis, and enforcement capabilities to not only target and seize illicit fentanyl, but also pursue investigations and take down criminal networks. Since the operations implementation just 6 weeks ago, we've made 88 arrests and made more than 70 seizures of fentanyl, totaling over 4,000 pounds. But this collaborative approach, along with continued investments in frontline officers, intelligence research specialists, and advanced technologies, will be key in disrupting the dynamic threat of TCOs and intercepting the illicit drugs that cross our borders. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member Britt, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss Homeland Security investigations, efforts to disrupt and dismantle transnational criminal organizations, also known as TCOs. The threat posed by transnational criminal organizations is pervasive. Criminal organizations do not limit themselves to a single criminal enterprise. These criminal organizations have expanded beyond narcotic smuggling and have morphed into polycriminal TCOs involved in the associated crimes of weapons trafficking, human smuggling, cybercrime, fraud, money laundering, and other crimes, all of which HSI investigates. TCOs have evolved beyond insular entities and seek partnerships with competing TCOs in furtherance of their criminal activities. For example, the illicit collaboration between Chinese TCOs and Mexican cartels have created a complex criminal ecosystem that is fueling money laundering and narcotics trafficking. Chinese money laundering organizations, or MLOs, have developed sophisticated networks in the US, Mexico, China, and throughout Asia to facilitate money laundering schemes. These organizations use a vast global infrastructure to clean illicit proceeds for various criminal organizations, including Mexican cartels. Mexican cartels have taken over our fentanyl production and operate on an industrial scale. They are procuring precursor chemicals from China and synthesizing these chemicals in Mexico to produce fentanyl. Mexican cartels then smuggle the fentanyl into the U.S. in either powder or pill form for easy distribution. Chinese criminal organizations facilitate the trafficking and distribution of fentanyl pills through the sale of industrial pill press equipment to Mexican cartels, who then turn powdered fentanyl into the pill form. HSI is actively disrupting the pill press supply chain and to date has seized over 1,200 pill presses and parts used to make deadly fentanyl-laced pills since October of 2022. As a principal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security, HSI combats TCOs through multiple avenues of criminal enforcement. Not only does HSI target narcotic smuggling activities of TCOs, but also targets the wide array of illegal activities TCOs employ to fuel their criminal organizations, such as human trafficking, human smuggling, the financial networks utilized to launder illicit TCO proceeds and profit from this activity, and the firearms trafficking undertaken to support violent TCO activities. HSI's efforts to combat TCOs begin abroad. HSI has the largest international investigative presence within DHS, comprised of hundreds of HSI special agents, strategically assigned to 93 offices in 56 countries. HSI and our counterparts in other countries identify and disrupt sources of illicit drugs, smuggling networks, and money laundering operations. These efforts enable HSI and its partners to prevent dangerous narcotics and other illicit goods from reaching our borders and stop illicit outbound flows of illegally derived currency and weapons. Our international counter-narcotics efforts is significantly enhanced by HSI's Transnational Criminal Investigative Units, TCIUs. The TCIUs are comprised of vetted foreign law enforcement and prosecutors that work jointly with HSI to disrupt and dismantle TCOs by leveraging the host country's legal system through mutually beneficial investigations and prosecutions. Domestically, HSI's Border Enforcement Security Task Forces, or BESS, represent one of the agency's premier tools for turning border seizures into TCO toppling investigations. HSI BESS partnerships among state and local law enforcement task force officers are integral to HSI's success in countering TCOs who traffic in narcotics and firearms and threaten the public safety of the United States. The primary mission of the BESS is to combat existing and emerging TCOs by employing the full range of federal, state, local, tribal, and international law enforcement resources. There are currently 88 BESS comprised of thousands of law enforcement officers and personnel representing more than 200 agencies and National Guard units. In addition to the BESS, each of HSI's 253 offices located in all 50 states and multiple U.S. territories dedicates assets to combat TCOs. HSI also uses its authorities domestically to target procurement networks responsible for smuggling U.S. origin weapons into Mexico. This includes Operation Without a Trace, a unique DHS effort with the ATF and other law enforcement partners in Mexico to fight the illegal trafficking of firearms and ammunition from the United States into Mexico. Despite these efforts, HSI recognizes there's significant work to be done on all fronts to disrupt and dismantle TCOs. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here before you today. Your continued support of HSI and our enduring efforts to combat TCOs domestically and internationally. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all for your testimony. We'll begin a round of 5-minute questions, and I'll begin. First, let me make a small amendment to my opening statement. We are having a conversation today about the supply side piece of this equation, but we should all be sober about the fact that our supply side approaches in the past have not worked tremendously well unless they are matched with a demand side approach. And so, while our committee is charged with trying to stop the supply, we have to understand that this is one piece of a much bigger picture. Let me start with you, Ms. Sabatino. Senator Britt noted that the president's budget requested a 1% reduction in funding for the Department of Homeland Security. I share her concerns about what that would mean for the department. But the Republican House response to that was a 22% cut in funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which is seemingly catastrophic. And so let me just ask you a simple question. Can you effectively fight the flow of fentanyl, detect the flow, seize the fentanyl into the United States if your budget is cut by 22%?
If we had to contemplate making that significant a cut to our budget, obviously we would look to non-pay resources first, but given what our salary percentages are, we would exhaust that pretty quickly for non-pay and have to look at potential adverse personnel actions, which would result in limiting our ability to affect operations, be nimble, and adapt quickly to evolving threats. I think that could also cascade into potentially collapsing operations, lane closures in our land borders, staffing in our airports, and at a time when we're looking to expand hours of operation on our northern border, it would be incredibly challenging to do that.
Well, you just listed in about 30 seconds a pretty stunning list of impacts. Closures of ports of entry or limitations on hours, personnel being let go, the inability to continue investigations at a current pace. This is a really important discussion. We need to continue. I don't want to use all my time on it, but the impacts are pretty grave. Mr. Manders, just share with us about where this product is coming in. I use the statistic that I've heard repeatedly in my opening testimony that 95% is coming through the ports of entry. Obviously, we don't have all the information to know, but is that number about right? Do we contemplate that the lion's share of fentanyl is coming in through our ports of entry versus coming in through individuals that are crossing in between the ports of entry?
Yes, sir. That's a fair assessment based off seizure data. Obviously, seizure data is not necessarily indicative of flow, but is one of the best predictors of flow. But approximately 90-95% are at ports of entry.
So really important for where we make investments. If 90% of the product is coming in at the ports of entry, it makes sense to be focusing 90% of our new resources at the ports of entry. Mr. Milholland, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we best allocate resources. I appreciate the success you've had in shutting down presses and manufacturing facilities, but man, that sounds like a tough job, especially when a manufacturing facility that's churning out millions of pills could fit in the corner of this room. That's like finding a needle in the haystack. Is it more effective, just as effective, to look at the precursors? Part of the reason we went down to meet with President López Obrador was to get the Mexican government's commitment to work with us and China to try to interrupt the flow of precursor. China knows everything that leaves that country. It appears to me that we could maybe have a bigger impact by trying to stop the precursor from getting into the hands of the cartels in the first place.
Yes, Senator, thank you for that question. I had the pleasure of serving as the head of all of HSI's investigations and operations in Mexico for 4 years before I came here, which is our largest and busiest overseas office. And I can tell you that this fentanyl crisis begins and ends in China. And I can lay that out for you. Precursor chemicals are shipped out of China into Mexico. The precursor chemicals are synthesized into fentanyl in Mexico. It's smuggled through our southwest border, and then it's sold within the United States, poisoning our public. At the same time, the illicit sales of the proceeds of that fentanyl is increasingly laundered outside of our country by Chinese money laundering organizations. This used to be an industry that was dominated by Colombian transnational criminal organizations charging 10 to 12% to launder illicit funds. That's now controlled by the Chinese, charging 1 to 2% to launder money back outside the U.S. And at the same time, the pill presses that are used to press that finished fentanyl into pills are coming in from China exclusively. We just seized over 200 pill presses at a warehouse in Los Angeles. These came in directly from China. This problem begins and ends in China. We work very closely with the Mexican authorities. As you just pointed out, we seized over 3 million pounds of precursor chemicals at those western seaports of Mexico in the last 3 years with our fantastic partners in Mexico.
Well, one of the few upsides of a totalitarian state is that very little happens in China that doesn't happen under the control and direction or knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party. And so we have an ability to demand of China a change in policy that stops that product and stops that equipment from moving into Mexico and the United States. Lastly, before I turn it over to Senator Britt, I just thank you, Ms. Sabatino, for giving us a sense of what has been done in a very short time to stop the flow of cash and weapons out of the United States. It's a limited operation. We only put in about $50 million, and only part of that has been expended. But the fact that you have already stopped $7 million and 450 weapons just tells you how much additional gain there is to be had if we continue to expand on that investment. So appreciate that. Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that combating this has to be a comprehensive approach, and whole government, everybody working together. So my question really is, how are you all communicating? I know under the Department of Homeland Security, each of you has your individual lane, but how are we ensuring that we are sharing the information that is needed to actually take down these cartels? Who's responsible for that? I mean, I know ultimately it's the secretary, but who, interagency-wise, looks at what OFO is doing and what HSI knows and connecting those dots?
Thank you for the question, Senator. HSI's relationship with CBP runs very deep. We're communicating daily on these types of issues. We have over 7,000 special agents within the United States. We respond to every single seizure made by CBP at a port of entry, whether that's land, sea, or air. So we inherently have a lot of overlap in the things that we do, and we communicate.
Is there a
daily.
person that oversees this, that connects the dots between the two, or is it just on case-by-case basis and working?
Do you want it to, NTC?
I can certainly address that, and I think we have to look at it at the different levels of the organization. Certainly at our port levels, our port directors are responsible for ensuring those relationships, and we have great relationships with HSI and investigations. Again, we're having them respond to seizures, but also sharing the information and the intelligence and the analysis, the post-seizure analysis, and feeding that into our intelligence cycle. At our regional levels, certainly our directors field operations engage with their counterparts, the SACs, the special agents in charge of the divisions out in the field. But I think a really important piece for us at the national level is the cooperation that we have at our National Targeting Center, where HSI is co-located with us and works also not just within the interagency and all of the information, bringing in the intel cycle, the information, but also our foreign partners.
Are there any challenges that you have in working together collaboratively? Any roadblocks? I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, we created the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that we broke down those things, and just want to make sure that that's not occurring here.
I'm not aware of any significant challenges. I think more communication is better, and we're very engaged in that with them.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. The amount of fentanyl that has been seized has actually astonishing, and I want to commend you for the work that you continue to do. I am concerned, though, about what's not being seized, and want to dig in a little bit to that. I mean, we are seeing it show up in our streets, in our schools, in our communities, and it has killed more than 250,000 Americans since 2018. So can you give us some idea, about the networks within the United States that are helping to give fentanyl and opioids into these American communities? We were talking about the Chinese. Obviously, we have said this begins and ends with China. But can you tell me a little bit more, drug cartels, and then it gets here to the U.S. What's happening once it gets here to the U.S.?
Sure. My colleagues talked a little bit about the two largest cartels in Mexico, Sinaloa and the Jalisco cartels. They have tentacles into every single city in this country.
In this country?
In this country. And that's how they sell their drugs, and that's how they kill our citizens.
How do they find these people? Are they migrants? Are they gangs that we have here? How does that work?
There's transnational criminal organizations throughout this country that sell narcotics to those that are looking for narcotics. Yes, some use gangs to sell those, but gangs mostly work through extortion. They don't generally just sell drugs. But there's all sorts of criminal organizations operating throughout that are selling this.
Gosh. Tell me, are they gaining footholds? Are the drug cartels, the Mexican drug cartels, gaining footholds here in our country?
They definitely have a big influence here in our country.
Do you see that trend moving to where they have more and more influence?
I don't know that they have more and more influence. I know that we are committing more and more resources towards it with HSI every single year. We have our border enforcement security task forces, of which we have over 4,000 state and local officers that serve as a force multiplier for HSI to work narcotics investigations, to work human trafficking organizations, to work human smuggling networks as well. We have our fentanyl suppression teams, which Senator Murphy talked about earlier, that are tracking those overdose deaths. They're taking that pill, they're tracking that pill that was used in that overdose all the way back through Mexico, all the way back to the precursor chemical that was used to make it.
And how do your efforts differ here domestically versus what you're doing internationally?
We have 7,000 special agents in HSI. We have a huge overseas presence. As we look at this as a worldwide issue, partnerships are our main focus, not only domestically through our border enforcement security task forces, through our partnerships with CBP, but also internationally. This starts internationally. I spoke a little bit about my time heading our Mexico offices. That's just one of 90 overseas offices we have. And we take a lot of pride in foreign partnerships that we develop there. We have our transnational criminal investigative units in 14 countries overseas, where there's local investigators, local police officers that are assigned by the country that they work in there, that we vet, that we train, that we fund, and we work investigations of joint interest with them, not only in their home country, but in ours. And that's kind of what differentiates the way that we do things overseas.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Senator Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Murphy and Ranking Member Britt. This hearing really is an important reminder to all of us that the strength of our economy and the safety of our communities is directly related to our ability to keep goods flowing at our ports and our borders and keep our doors open to immigrants and refugees while stopping transnational criminal activity, especially fentanyl, that is devastating all of our communities. I really appreciate Senator Murphy's focus on this crisis, and I hope we can all join him in pushing to provide more resources to fight it, instead of putting a wrecking ball to DHS and our fight against fentanyl, like we saw the House Republican vote last week that really has a decimating effect to our budget. I actually visited the border in Arizona a few weeks ago, and I met with border officials and families that are seeking asylum in America. I heard directly about the challenges we are facing when it comes to combating human trafficking and drug trafficking and other criminal activity, and getting kids and refugees and asylum seekers the care and support they need. It's really important for us to understand that many of these families that are showing up at our border are victims and survivors. They are fleeing the violence from the same transnational criminal organizations the U.S. government is fighting. Those criminal organizations are the root cause of a lot of suffering, from the fentanyl and the drugs that are flooding our streets, to the persecution and violence and torture that leads so many refugees to flee their homes in their own countries, to the misinformation and manipulation that is fueling these atrocious trafficking operations. So if we want to protect our communities from illegal opioids and stop the dangerous human trafficking across our border and help these families who are fleeing persecution, we've got to work to shut down these cartels and the other transnational criminal organizations that are really driving so much of this devastation. And we cannot do that if we're slashing the resources we desperately need to protect our communities and stop this trafficking at our border, which is what I fear the Republicans voted for last week in the House. So I just want to remind everybody, keeping our families safe means that we fund these agencies in a way that allows us to protect our families across the border. So I appreciate both of you working on this. I want to follow up on Senator Murphy's question. He asked you, Ms. Sabatino, what the impact of a 22% cut is. Mr. Mandrick, I want to ask you the same thing. How would that affect your agency and your ability to collect and analyze intelligence?
Thank you for the question. I would certainly have a significant impact on our capability, both from a manpower and our overall functioning. We would not be able to support as heavily we do things like Operation Blue Lotus that DX Sabatino had mentioned. It would directly impact our geospatial analysis, so full motion video. One of those areas we combined work very closely with HSI on their pole cam analysis. One of those things would be impacted. Our human intelligence capability in the program would certainly suffer from any setbacks from a funding standpoint, as well as the training, development, and delivery for intelligence professionals and law enforcement professionals across the agency.
And Mr. Milholen, how will that bill affect your ability to investigate transnational TCOs.
Yeah, thank you for the question. HSI's job is grown increasingly complicated over the last several years. We're having to commit additional resources towards training, towards recruiting solid people into these fields that include cyber and financial crimes. And we need to continue to invest in our workforce. Any hindrance of that, any pullback of resources on that would significantly hamper our ability to go after transnational criminal organizations.
Okay, thank you. And let me ask you as well, you talked about China being where it starts. My assumption was India was part of that as well, correct?
We see a small amount of precursor chemicals that are coming into Mexico from India, but our diplomatic relations and our law enforcement relations there are pretty strong, so we've had a lot of success with them stopping that.
Okay, how do you work with other agencies and international parties to stop the flow of these precursor chemicals before they come and are used to manufacture fentanyl?
Yes, ma'am. Our main resource outside the United States are strong partnerships with foreign governments, with law enforcement in those countries. We have about 14 transnational criminal investigative units around the world. We're trying to expand that program as we go forward. These are vetted law enforcement officers from that host country that we train at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in the United States, and they go back to the country they're from. They embed with HSI agents in that country, and the thing that makes them the most unique is we work investigations of joint interest. We don't just ask them to find someone who may have a warrant in the United States to extradite back to the United States. We're fine if they prosecute in their home country or if we prosecute it in the United States, and this is a way we build partnerships for the future.
Okay, and really quickly, I'm really glad that you've rolled out these non-intrusive inspection tools so we can more identify some of this contraband at our ports of entry. Do you have the resources to scale that up?
HSI is closely tracking CBP's rollout of non-intrusive inspection. As we respond to every single seizure made at a port of entry that CBP makes, and we handle the follow-up investigation from that seizure,
Yep.
As they roll out non-intrusive inspection, we can only assume that seizures will go up, which means we'll take additional response from HSI to handle those investigations and will require additional resources.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Murray. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also join you in welcoming these panelists here and certainly appreciate what you do every single day. In January, I visited the southern border with Ranking Member Britt, and the stories we were told down there and heard of human trafficking was just totally incredible. Today, I would like to discuss publicly available information and how it is used to create relevant and timely open source intelligence that addresses evolving threats to our national security. And Mr. McCollin, you testified last March before the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight Committees that HSI worked closely with the Customs and Border Protection National Targeting Center to examine large volumes of data, which you used to successfully intercept the shipment of fentanyl precursors being sent directly from China to the United States via commercial air and maritime shipping. In May of 2019, at the request of the United States, China placed all fentanyl-related substances under national control, and the number of seizures dropped significantly, almost to zero, I understand. This forced China's traffickers to send fentanyl and fentanyl precursors to Mexico, as we've discussed, where it is manufactured by drug cartels and smuggled into the United States using traditional smuggling techniques. In Mississippi, we have researchers who work closely with our national security agencies to analyze publicly available information and apply data science methods to gain insight and provide actionable intelligence and problems just like this. So my question to all the witnesses: how has your agency's open source intelligent operations adapted to this change in strategy by these traffickers?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. So we are in the early stages of really fine-tuning our open source intelligence capabilities focused on publicly available information, so nothing that's encrypted, it's available to anybody, following the intelligence community privacy diversity requirements. So what we're doing is finding them from a few different angles. We do not have a investigative authority, so ours is kind of an indications and warnings function. So the identification of emerging trends, patterns, potential individuals who may be marketing this in an open matter, and then provide that to our folks who do have investigative authorities across the entire USG. So we're in the indications, warning, early tipping part is how we're exploiting the available information.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for the question, and I think we, as the operators in CBP at the ports of entry, really are the ones that stand to benefit from the work that the Office of Intelligence is doing in that space and taking that information, turning it into tactical and actionable information for our officers to use in decision-making, but also in sharing the information with our partners that we engage with on a daily basis.
Thank you.
It's very similar for HSI, Senator. We have a very large intelligence unit that crunches criminal investigative intelligence that our investigators are getting every day from not only judicially obtained information, but by our vast network of sources throughout the world, and they get that to our investigators on the front line to action.
Thank you, and I have a little time left, and I really want to ask this to everyone. Cooperation with the private sector, universities, and existing research centers is critical to ensuring the department is producing new solutions to face constantly evolving threats to our nation's homeland security. Can you share with the subcommittee potential areas for enhancement collaboration with these entities to further refine the technologies for the specific use of CBP and HSI?
Again, thank you for the question. We have a very robust student volunteer program, the equivalent of an internship program within CBP. We have approximately 30 individuals from a wide range of universities and local schools that spend their summer months working with our intelligence professionals. Most of these folks are either focused on national security, law enforcement, or something in the big data space. They bring to bear a lot of the unique skills and capabilities that we often don't have, such as data analytics, data scientists, allowing us to kind of take that big data that hasn't been publicly available and help us put a new lens on it. Most of the folks who currently work in the intelligence space have for quite a while, so we tend to look at things in one lens. So bringing in new generation folks with different experiences, different education, it really helped us shift our understanding of what the threats look like.
Thank you for that answer.
No, certainly we welcome the partnership with, vendors, industry, academia, to enhance our efforts and build our capabilities out on the border. I think certainly a good example in leveraging within DHS, the Office of Science and Technology, that helps us partner with specific industries, or research groups to look at new ways or technologies that we can leverage, in combating the threats.
Senator, public-private partnership is grown increasingly important for HSI as we go forward. We recently established a cross-border financial crime center that is a partnership not only amongst federal law enforcement, but private industry, banking institutions, and others, so that we can share as much intelligence as possible to focus on investigations going forward.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I ran over my time.
That's all right. Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. Senator Tester is deferred to Senator Baldwin, so we'll go to Senator Baldwin next.
Thank you. I need to preside at 3, so I appreciate that thoughtfulness. Great to have you here. Thank you for your service. While Wisconsin is not a border state, the work that Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security do at our southern border is essential to keeping our families safe. And I am eager to discuss why the funding for your work is so important to our safety and our national security. I'm not going to ask a question on this because of time, but I want to associate myself with the comments by Chair Murray and Chair Murphy about the impact of the recent House Republican-passed legislation that could well result in massive cuts of up to 22% in this budget at a time when I think uniformly we're all saying you need to meet more resources to meet the challenge of the day. So I just wanted to make that quick association. In Wisconsin, between 2019 and 2021, fentanyl overdose deaths grew by a staggering 97%. It's in just a couple-year period. And in no small part due to the synthetic fentanyl and counterfeit pills that are made to look just like prescription name brand opioids, stimulants, and anxiety medications. You've talked already a little bit about how CBP and HSI work individually and in partnership to address the flow of counterfeit pharmaceuticals at our southwest border. I'm interested to know a little bit more about your partnerships with state and local law enforcement, and if you would support additional resources or coordination resources at the state and local level for this purpose. And also, since you, Mr. Milholland, discussed it, you talked about your work with Mexican partners and the need for that to be there for seizure of these pill presses and shutting down of operations. And the last thing I would note in this question, it's a big one, is when I was recently at the border in Texas, I was shown a map of sort of who, the perception, and I think it was accurate, of who controls for order purposes the land adjacent to the U.S. in Mexico. And it seemed like such a long stretch of that border was the day-to-day control was the cartels, not the Mexican government. So maybe you can add a little bit about that challenge when I ask you that big question. Why don't you start, Mr. Milholland?
No problem. Thank you for the question. To your first question, to all of your questions, partnerships are the main way that we get things done in law enforcement. Not only state and local partnerships with police departments, with state authorities, with our federal partners who are here at the table with us and others in DOJ, but also overseas. We take a lot of pride in the partnerships that we make. We do a lot of this through our border enforcement security task forces. These are 4,000 task force officers assigned to HSI throughout the country, who we use as a force multiplier on the investigations that we conduct. And we do the same thing overseas in places like Mexico, throughout Central, South America, and Asia with our transnational criminal investigative units. And I can tell you, we have very strong partnerships in Mexico at the working level. There's a lot of trust between us. There's a lot of intelligence that's being shared, and there's a lot of seizures and prosecutions that's coming from that. I referenced the 3 million pounds of precursor chemicals that we've been able to seize at Mexican ports of entry in the last 3 years. That's directly resulting from the partnerships that we built there over the last couple of years.
Just going to say, from a CBP perspective, certainly we foster a whole-of-government approach to tackling it, knowing we can't do it on our own, and that's at the federal, local, and state level. I think certainly at our ports of entry, the relationships with our state and local partners are absolutely critical to the success that we have, and to all extents possible, share information that we develop, certainly from seizures, to ensure that they have visibility on what the threats are and that we receive that information back, and partner with them in task forces along with Homeland Security investigations. From an international perspective, I think that the ongoing communication just at our land borders with Canada and Mexico is a daily occurrence, consistently working with them and sharing information again to the extent possible. But also our investments overseas. Obviously, we have our pre-clearance locations, but we have the Container Security Initiative overseas, deployments across the globe, as well as our Immigration Advisory Program. But we also invest quite a bit in capacity building and building out those resources and educating our partners overseas as well.
And very similar to what's been mentioned, it is the partnerships. We very focused on a deployment of our personnel to the field where we send them, whether it's the state fusion centers that DHS puts out or the high-intensity drug trafficking areas throughout the country, our deployment of personnel internationally with the different task forces that are out there, and the sharing of our intelligence reporting.
Thank you. Thank you for deferring, and I'll submit an additional question for the record.
Thank you. Senator Tester.
I'll yield to Senator. Sure? Well, I didn't want to bump you out of line, too. Peters, maybe, but not you.
You got to stop letting people walk all over you.
That's exactly right. This is for Mr. Mulholland. In your testimony, you talk about how HSI not only targets drug smuggling operations, but also targets financial networks and resources that fund these illegal activities. I recently had the opportunity to introduce the Fend Off Fentanyl Act with Ranking Member Britt and a bipartisan group of senators to increase Treasury's ability to sanction criminal organizations that traffic fentanyl. So the question is this. Does HSI need additional authorities, or can it work with Treasury to hit these criminal organizations where it hurts, which is in their wallets?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the end of that question, sir?
Can you hit them where it hurts, which means can you impact their money?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the main things that HSI does. We have a strong history in money laundering type investigations. I talked a little bit about the Chinese influence in the United States now, bringing out the illicit proceeds of all fentanyl sales.
Right.
Just stood up a cross-border financial crime center to do exactly what you're talking about, sir.
Can you explain to me how the money from drug sales and trafficking is getting back to Mexican cartels and Chinese criminal organizations? And if you have any opportunity to stop that, how are you doing it?
Absolutely. There's several different ways. Money laundering is very complicated. There's bulk cash smuggling, very, very easy to understand, bulk cash going across the border. But there's a lot of different ways the Chinese are doing it that is hard to track. Trade-based money laundering, very difficult to track. We do have some ways to do that. And you also see it through mirror accounts. I know you've heard a little bit about this, which is difficult to track as well, but we do have the resources right now to do that, and we have had a lot of successful
investigations. How much is being transferred via crypto?
A lot of transactions are happening via crypto, specifically on the dark net.
Okay. A lot of focus right now is placed on combating the Mexican drug cartels. I think most people understand that we need to hold China accountable as much as Mexican drug cartels for the fentanyl trafficking. What is DHS doing to stop Chinese criminal organizations?
Chinese criminal organizations?
Yep. What are you doing to stop them?
Well, I'd refer back to my answer on how we're stopping precursor chemicals coming in to Mexico. We're trying to track those back to China. We do have relations in China. We do have offices in China that have a little bit of law enforcement contact there. We're trying to make.
Have you had any success on having those offices in China work with you and actually stop garbage from coming here, poison?
It's pretty difficult, sir.
Okay. DHS is planning to end Title 42 next week. And I don't think ending the practice of Title 42 all makes a lot of sense right now, but I am concerned about the administration's preparation or lack of it with an expected surge of migrants that will come to a border. I spent a good portion of last weekend listening to the radio, and this was on all the time, interviewing folks on the southern border, talking about how there's a bunch of folks lined up to come in because they think the border's going to be open, okay? Criminal organizations will also take advantage of any sign of weakness at the border to do their drug thing. Just yesterday, DHS asked for 1,500 additional active duty military to help border operations. That is going to happen. So the question is, and it can be for anybody who wants to answer it on the panel, with the 1,500 additional active duty military folks, is there any plan to reassign agents from the northern border or ports or anywhere to the southern border, or will those 1,500 active duty troops secure the border?
I'll take that one.
Go ahead.
We're not currently anticipating drawing down any more resources to supplement the TDYs that we have had there for an extended period of time. That being said, any evolving threat, we're always prepared to look across our operations.
Okay. But for right now, the 1,500 active duty military, I think there's 2,500 guardsmen too that are already down there. Is that not correct?
I would have to defer to the Border Patrol on that. Those 1,500 are going to be supporting Border Patrol operations for administrative duties.
All right. So, and I'm not saying this is a negative, can anybody answer how long those 1,500 active duty military are going to be down there?
We'll take that as a get back.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here and for what you do every day. New Hampshire, my home state, has had some of the highest numbers of overdose deaths on a per capita basis of any state in the country. 2022 was the worst year for overdose deaths since 2017. And obviously, what we're seeing from fentanyl is that it's a huge contributor to that. About 70% of those deaths are fentanyl related. But I want to follow up on Senator Tester's question about the northern border, because in 2022, CBP reported a 302% increase in activity over the year before along the northern border. And early figures from this year showing that there's an even higher year-over-year increase in places along the U.S.-Canada border, like the Swanton sector, which affects New Hampshire and Vermont. Actually, it stretches from New York to New Hampshire. But CBP still has not returned all the personnel that have been pulled to address the southern border. So I know, Ms. Sabatino, you mentioned the northern border. I know that 25 agents have been sent back to the Swanton sector, but will the 1,500 soldiers that are on the southern border affect our ability to return the remaining officers to the northern border, to the Swanton sector?
With respect to the 1,500 and supporting the Border Patrol operations, they will be doing administrative functions, and I would have to get back for you from the Border Patrol on exactly what that would mean in terms of agents. In terms of the resource support that we have with the existing TDYs to the southwest border, we do look across all of our environments and determine the least potential impact to those environments to draw down resources to support those TDYs. We're not anticipating releasing any of those TDYs in the near term, but it is always something that we are continually assessing. And again, with any threat, as it evolves, whether it diminishes or increases, we work very closely with our port stakeholders to advise them of any anticipated impacts that we're going to potentially have.
And is there any sense from CBP about whether they are TCOs that are responsible for that increased activity at the northern border?
So in terms of the increased activity of migration coming from Canada southbound, we do not see a heavy correlation to the TCOs. Historically, what we have seen, of course, was the crossing fees happening at the plazas that were mentioned earlier. We have seen them move more into a full-scale facilitation, but those do remain focused on moving individuals from Central America to the southwest border, not to the northern border, ma'am.
And do you all think there's any benefit in designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations? Does that give you all any more authorities to do what you need to do to address their activities?
Well, ma'am, for any designations, we would defer to the Department of State for any FTO designations. However, we are fairly comfortable that would...
Well, I'm not asking you about whether that should happen. I'm asking you whether that would give you any additional authorities to intercept the activities of cartels.
With the Kingpin Act and Executive Order 14059, we do have what we believe are the authorities required to combat TCO activity.
And do the rest of you agree with that?
I don't believe that would really change our methodology and techniques in trying to tackle these or enhance. There are certainly other agencies that may benefit from that.
I'd agree. We have the criminal authorities we need. Chief amongst our concerns with that would be maintaining our strong relationships with our foreign partners. So we wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize that.
I was in South America a couple of weeks ago with a group of senators, and one of the things that I was surprised to hear, we visited Panama, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil, was that they are not seeing fentanyl in South America. And in fact, when we were in Brazil, they told us that they had had their first death from fentanyl in the country that had just been reported the week before we got there. Do we expect to see fentanyl moving into those other countries in South America?
From what we've seen from the movement to synthetics, it does appear to be a bit of a delay. So same thing when methamphetamine kind of hit the market, it was a U.S. issue prior to going anywhere else. Then it worked its way into Europe and some of the Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand. We didn't really see a big population explosion of that usage in Central South America. While there likely will be increased fentanyl use, it does not appear that it's going to be an emerging trend to the level we're seeing here.
Everybody agree with that? Can I ask one more question, Mr. Chairman? Because I know that the chairman said that we're focused on the we're not focused on the demand side here. But obviously, the only way we're really going to address what's happening with illegal substances is to deal with the prevention of that. If you all could fund one initiative that you think is really important for prevention, what would you increase to fund?
I think based off the trends and patterns we're seeing, it's the growing utilization of counterfeit pharmaceuticals, the M30 pills, counterfeit oxycodone. The individuals are thinking that it's a legitimate pharmaceutical, not understanding the dangers. So more of an awareness campaign on the counterfeits.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with Jack Mandrick. The messaging and information to the communities about ultimately what the impact is. I know there's quite a bit out there, and again, looking for those targeted groups for that messaging.
Thank you.
I agree with my counterparts. We're continually conducting outreach to not only schools, but communities as well. And we need to continue that. We need to do better at that. And we need to commit more resources to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our three witnesses. Appreciate the work you do each and every day. This is going to be a question to all three of you. In March, the Department of Homeland Security stood up Operation Blue Lotus, a CBP and HSI coordinated surge operation. In only a month, it led to the seizure of over 4,000 pounds of fentanyl at our ports of entry. So my question to you is, what led to the success of Operation Blue Lotus, and is there something Congress can do to help you with these types of operations? We can start here.
Yes, Senator. Thank you for that question. Over the course of the last several months, we've surged several hundred special agents from interior offices to the border to assist CBP after a seizure is made, specifically of fentanyl. And those seizures have obviously increased a lot over the last couple of months. We're handling the follow-up investigation from those seizures. We're surging as many resources towards those follow-up investigations as possible. You mentioned the 4,000 pounds of fentanyl they seized in a couple of months. That's led to over about 135 arrests as well. But we look at that as the first phase. We're also illuminating those networks that are bringing the fentanyl into the United States. We're illuminating the networks that's bringing the money back out of the United States. And we anticipate much further investigative activity, indictments and prosecutions down the line. And we would welcome any additional resources, of course.
I think equally as important as interdicting the narcotics themselves and preventing them from entering the communities is also the investment and development of information out of those seizures, and making sure, and really drove Blue Lotus in the partnership with HSI and CBP, as well as other federal and state partners, was to really align that kind of intelligence strategy and that tactical information back to ports so that we could make those interdictions. I mentioned in my opening statement that the seizures begin before the ports of entry. So the best information that we can get before that, continued investments in our intelligence framework and resources certainly could be incredibly beneficial to sustaining or the ability to gain from these types of operations. I think pulse and surge operations are important. They're not necessarily something that we have to maintain in the manner with which they're affected. I think we have a number of examples where certain operations, we gain information, refine, and conduct additional or move operations as TCOs identify our enforcement methodologies and move around us. But the investments in the intelligence and analysis is critical for us.
Mm-hmm. I do believe the last part is probably the most significant we've seen. There was the initial stage of this was a very strong intelligence planning operation, identifying the times, the locations to surge, and then looking at these secondary impacts. If the TCOs do become aware of what's happening, what's going to be the next methodology, changes in conveyance, location, so having that follow-on, so it's not just pushing the illicit activity somewhere else, it's being prepared for that as well.
Yeah, very good. There's significant bipartisan support for increasing non-intrusive inspection capacity to aid CBP in interdicting drugs like fentanyl before they reach the communities, as you mentioned, is critical. But while Congress has increasingly provided resources for these systems, there are no current requirements in place for actual scanning rates. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be introducing legislation that will require CBP to use the systems that Congress has already funded to scan at least 40% of passenger vehicles and at least 90% of commercial vehicles entering our land ports of entry. Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner Sabinto, why has there been a delay in increasing the implementation and the use of these scanning machines, and what do you expect we'll be able to accomplish?
And we greatly appreciate the support from Congress to make those investments in NII technology, and we are currently underway with significant deployments across the southwest border. It was 53 multi-energy portals and 88 low-energy portals, and some funding from 2020 to procure 12 high-energy rail systems. And those deployments, we have several that have already been completed, about 6 of them. We've had 8 construction kickoff meetings completed for additional ports of entry, and will continue throughout the rest of the year. But the full timeline for that deployment is through fiscal year 26. And with the full deployment of that, we do expect and are very optimistic about achieving that goal of 40% for passenger vehicles and around 70% for commercial vehicles. However, we've seen great results already from the implementation in our 2 initial locations in Brownsville and Ansel Dewis. But what also goes hand in hand with that and is going to make us incredibly effective is the investments that you also made in building out the artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we're currently working with the industry to develop those algorithms with anticipated deployments expected by the beginning of the new fiscal year, end of this fiscal year, beginning of the new fiscal year.
If I just may ask a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So I understand that the AI is critically important. That hasn't been deployed yet. So you said that your timeline for that, and what has taken so long to deploy some of that technology? Because that enhances NII considerably.
Absolutely, and I think it was not an off-the-shelf type product. This is something that we really had to develop, and it was essentially our first endeavor into this in integrating it into our systems. So certainly gaining the knowledge, the education, working with the industry, certainly our partners in DHS, Science and Technology, and really leveraging the opportunity to get the right process and methodology down in order to affect it. We had our first RFI released in June of 2022. We had an industry day this past January, and an RFP that was released on April 14th, I believe, of this year. We're currently assessing the submissions from that RFP, and we'll be working to down select those specific vendors over the next couple of weeks.
How confident are you you're going to achieve your goal?
Very optimistic.
And what time again?
We're looking for the initial deployments. Now, again, the deployment of the technology, again, goes hand in hand with certainly having the system integration, which is a piece of it, and we expect to have that by the beginning, I should say the end of this fiscal year, beginning of the next fiscal year. And that algorithm deployment means that now it starts to learn as it's deployed.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters. Just to follow up, Senator Britt and I are going to ask a few final questions, and then we'll close out the hearing. You've been generous with your time. Just to follow up on Senator Peters' question, we've all been to these ports of entry. Space is really tight. And the president's budget, I believe, includes some significant funding to do the retrofits you need in order to be able to deploy this new NII technology. Obviously, if you're stopping 20, 30% more vehicles, you've got to have room to do that. So am I right about that, that you've got some hardscaping to do in order to get the NII maximally effective at your ports of entry? No, we do, and I did fail to mention the variables and the risks go with the funding to support the civil works in the deployments. And there are significant investments that have to be made. I believe $201 million of the president's budget request was specifically for civil works. Yep. Mr. Milhan, I want to go back to this question of precursor from China. I thank you for being straight with us. You said it's tough, it's hard work. I met with the now Chinese foreign minister a few months ago, and he repeated a claim that I think the Chinese government has made publicly, which is that our decision to sanction 2 Chinese narcotics agencies caused the Chinese government to pull back from our cooperation and coordination with them on narcotics enforcement matters. I take everything that the Chinese say to me with a grain of salt. But we did used to have a more functional relationship with them on this question of fentanyl, and that resulted in a decision by the Chinese to stop the finished product from coming into the United States, at least at the rate that it was 5 to 10 years ago. Is there any reason to believe that some of our sanctions policy right now, which is really about other things, is standing in the way of having a more functional dialogue with them about stopping precursor from being sent into Mexico or stopping presses from being sent into the United States?
The short answer, Senator, is I don't know. Law enforcement contact with the Chinese has ebbed and flowed over the years. We've had good relationships, and then we've had poor relationships. As you stated at the beginning of your question, they were shipping almost all the finished fentanyl into the United States at one point in time, and just a little bit of diplomatic pressure and just a little bit of law enforcement pressure stopped that. So I think that's a positive. I think that not only do we see precursor chemicals that lead directly to the synthesis of fentanyl, their only use is for fentanyl. We're coming into those Mexico ports. Now we're seeing precursor chemicals coming in there. They have commercial uses, which is increasingly difficult to regulate as well. But the way forward has to be by building that relationship stronger.
Yeah, my argument here is that we should prioritize fentanyl policy with China. I understand we've got a million different lines of effort with the Chinese, but if there is a path to get China to stop the movement of precursor into Mexico, and even if the impact of that is just to raise the price of the product in the United States, that would save lives here. And so I understand we got a lot of irons in the fire with China, but I want to prioritize the policy that ultimately gets less of this product going to Mexico and ending up in the United States. So appreciate your candor. Senator Britt, final questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk a little bit about the dark web. Seems like every day we're seeing a news article or someone being arrested that has used the dark web or encrypted messaging or payment services to sell or buy fentanyl. In fact, just yesterday we saw nearly 300 people that were arrested for breaking international drug enforcement operations. It was a record-breaking day to see what happened, and obviously this was targeted at these people selling fentanyl and other opioids on the dark web. My question is, what are we doing? Can you tell me a little bit about the efforts between HSI and CBP to target these traffickers online, specifically on the dark web? Yeah, any of you.
Sure. So from our perspective, what we're looking to do is that initial identification of potential individuals who are moving these goods. In many cases, the dark web purchases are for personal use, not necessarily for distribution size. So obviously interdiction is a key part of that, but once those individuals have been identified, whether it's an individual or some type of selector data, we do share that across the CBP enterprise, but also with our investigative partners to take that to the next level for the full-on investigations.
Senator, thank you for mentioning that case yesterday, which HSI played a very strong role in. I think that the rise that you're seeing in these online marketplaces directly correlates to the change in society that we're seeing, where people are less likely to want to do a face-to-face transaction with someone. They can buy their narcotics on the web. Instead of having to pay in person for something, they can use cryptocurrency to buy those things. So we're committing more and more people every year to cyber-enabled investigations. We're having to train them, equip them in different ways than we ever have before. And really the ground level place where we're doing that is at our Cybercrime Center. It's here in the National Capital Region. It's where everything happens in those types of investigations. And I have an open invitation for anybody on the committee to please visit and see what we're doing there.
Absolutely, I'd love to visit. Do you feel like you have the resources you need to keep up with these technological advances that you're seeing? And when I say resources, I do mean both funding and people.
I think it's difficult. I think the people that we're having to hire to do this are coming from a different walk of life than what we hired traditional law enforcement agents from before. We're having to recruit people that have strong backgrounds in cyber crimes or even in the financial sector, which takes more resources. The training that goes into making sure that they have all the knowledge they need to make those cases and the prosecutions is much greater than it has been in the past. So we'd welcome working with you and your staff to identify additional resources if possible. Yes.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add on dark web? No. Last question, Mrs. Sabatino, I want to ask you. As we've seen time and time again, whether it's smuggling of people, money, weapons, drugs, the cartels are able to adapt their methodology and make sure that they take whatever system we put in place, and then they seem to find a way to try to be 2 steps ahead of us. What trends are you seeing as it relates to how drugs are being brought in, particularly when it comes through our ports of entry? So in personal vehicles, we know the chair referenced that less than 40% of them are currently being scanned, and it's my understanding that even in the 40% that are scanned, it's not the entirety of the vehicle that is scanned every time. So one, is that correct? And then 2, the trends you're seeing with entry.
Currently, with our scan rates, we're at 1% to 2% for passenger vehicles and about 15 to 17% for commercial conveyances. As we deploy this technology, the goal is 40% of passenger vehicles and 70% of commercial vehicles. With respect to trends, and again, the vast majority is coming through the southwest border.
And real quick, just so I understand, even when you're scanning these vehicles, the 1% to 2% and then the 17% of commercial, so personal versus commercial, are you scanning the entirety of the vehicle?
Those will be drive-through scans of the entire vehicle. It's multi-energy portals for commercial conveyances and low-energy portals for passenger vehicles.
So it is both the top and the bottom of the vehicle?
Yeah, we can get you a more fulsome briefing on exactly the nuance of it. I'm not going to be able to explain technically.
Okay.
But
just making sure that they can't get ahead of us. If we're only scanning one portion of the vehicle, then obviously the drug cartels start to put things in other places and that type of thing. So that will be great information.
No, and I think what's important also is that it's one tool of many that we have. Our canine teams, certainly intelligence and analysis, our skilled, CBP officers, all of these resources that we commit to the screening of these, result in the interdictions.
Absolutely. And then the trends that you're seeing, have you seen any shift or how they're coming over through our ports of entry?
I can defer to Jim on the trends.
So as you mentioned, the TCOs unfortunately are very quick to adapt to any changes that put in place. Some of the things that we have seen in the recent months that have been kind of a growing concern is obviously the conveyances have not changed, but some of these smuggling techniques within them. Mm-hmm. So we've seen the growing use of what they call low boy trailers, the trailers that have a very low section but have very heavy equipment on them,
okay.
Hiding narcotics within those. Growing use of parasitic loads. So loads that are attached to an unwitting person's vehicle. Sometimes it's a magnetic attachment at the bottom with a GPS. With some vehicles, they're able to actually pop the trunks from underneath. Narcotics are concealed within. An unwitting person crosses border. They show no signs of nefarious activity for an officer to pick up because they don't know it's there. And then the vehicle's either followed or GPS is followed later on to remove those. So unfortunately, the groups have certainly evolved with our technology.
And do you feel like you have the proper technology to be able to detect this? I know that this question was asked previously, but just following up on that.
We, again, appreciate the investments that Congress has made in the non-intrusive inspection technology, and we look to continue to build out our capabilities, certainly working with the industry on any new technologies that are available. But, our non-intrusive is, the large-scale drive-through systems, but also the small handheld devices that are incredibly valuable, as well as the testing technology to quickly determine, what we are encountering, but also the investments for laboratory and scientific services. We have a number of forward-deployed labs at our ports of entry that make for quick analysis and able to make quick decisions on that for both ourselves as well as our investigative partners. So all of these things combined, but also, again, the resources and the training for our Customs and Border Protection officers is what is absolutely critical and tantamount to all. They're our most valuable resource there.
Thank you, and thank you all for what you do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll just make a final note, having visited several of these ports of entry and seen the technology. I've looked at these images and they look totally inconclusive to me, and so it just speaks to the skill and the experience that our personnel have on the border, that we're able to catch as much as we do. And I know ultimately AI may help, but we've got a lot of brave and capable professionals protecting this country. And so let me just end there to thank you all for your testimony and for all that serve with you and underneath you who are engaged in the fight to protect our country from this scourge of addiction. We're going to keep the record open until May 10th, so you can get your questions in before then. With that, our subcommittee stands adjourned.